Well, I'm very happy to be here at this splendid meeting and have the opportunity of speaking about Hayek. Hayek was, of course, one of the leading lights of the free market-oriented and freedom-oriented philosophy in our time. And it's very fitting that an organization, a meeting such as this, devote some time to commemorate him. Before I begin, one little comment on the terminological aspect about liberals and libertarians and whether Hayek would have been a libertarian. Hayek had great difficulty in defining himself. The word liberal in Europe means what I think, more or less, what the word libertarian means in the United States. In the United States, the word liberal was appropriated by the left. So that creates a great confusion. Also in Europe and in countries in the part of Latin America where I come from, the word libertarian means anarchist. So that creates another problem. Hayek ended by defining himself as an old Whig, which is arcane to most people. But he had great difficulty in defining himself. He was not far away from people who call themselves libertarians. Friedrich August von Hayek was born in Vienna on the 8th of May, 1899. He came from a middle-class family. His father, a doctor, practiced as a civil servant. Both Dr. and Mrs. Hayek were from Roman Catholic origin, but they were not practicing. And Friedrich was raised as an agnostic and remained so all his life. But as I will mention later, he came to attach great importance to religion for the maintenance of liberty as a transmitter of ethical traditions. When Friedrich Hayek was finishing his secondary school, the First World War broke out, and he was conscripted into the Austro-Hungarian army and served in the Italian front. That, of course, was lucky that he didn't have to go to the horrible butchery of the Western Front. In fact, we know little about his soldiering days, except one of the few things we do know is that a comrade in arms lent him a couple of books on economics at the front during a lull at the Piave. And this sealed his professional future. On returning from the war, he went to college. He went to the University of Vienna, where he studied economics. At the law school, because following the French tradition, the Austro-Hungarian taught economics at the law school. And he found the atmosphere of the law school, the university in general, very stimulating intellectually. He was encouraged to follow many courses. He took courses in Greek drama and history of art. And he did very well at the university, better than he had at secondary school. And in 1921, he got his master's degree, and in 23, his PhD. And then something very important happened. He, under very adventurous circumstances, went to the United States on his own decision. He was banking at the promise of a professor in Columbia University to the effect that he would employ him as a research assistant. So he could afford to buy just a one-way passage and had $20 in his pocket when he arrived. And to his horror, he found out that Jenks, Isaiah Jenks was the American professor, was on holiday and unreachable. And then he was confronted with very black prospects. He had very little English, not enough to get a decent job. And he was about to accept a job as a dishwasher in a restaurant in 6th Avenue when finally Jenks arrived and rescued him, and he employed him for 6 months as a research assistant, and then obtained a modest scholarship for him that lasted another 9 months. So these 15 months in an Anglo-Saxon atmosphere gave him perfect command of English and a knowledge of the Anglo-Saxon academic life and world, which were extremely important subsequently in his life. Back in Vienna, he was employed by a commission that had something to do with the enforcement of the peace treaty, in which von Mises was a director as a representative of the Chamber of Commerce. And he began writing. He started his book, Prices and Production, which is the only book that the Nobel Committee quoted on awarding him the Prize Nobel in 1974. And then he wrote a number of articles for journals, for economic journals. A number of them on the subject of the theory of consumption, of underconsumption rather, which was very much in the air given the depression, the 1922-23 recession. And just by chance again, Hayek wrote, an article by Hayek attracted the attention of an English economist, Robbins, Lord Robbins as he later was. And another coincidence was that Robbins was the only English economist who understood German. And he was attracted at Hayek's articles because he thought he would be a suitable debater to oppose Keynes. So he had him invited to give 4 lectures at the London School of Economics, or LSE. And he did go. He had just married and with his wife, and they were a great success. So they invited him to teach as a visiting professor in 1931-32. And this was also very successful. And so they offered him a permanent chair. So he established his residence in England. He found himself perfectly at home in England. Of course, this wouldn't have happened if he hadn't had the level of English that he had acquired in the United States. And his immersion in the Anglo-Saxon culture, that was extremely important. He acquired English nationality, and which he kept until his death. I think that there is a lot, very frequent mentions of the Austrian school as an influence on Hayek. It's true of the famous trilogy Wiener, Wiese, and Böhm-Bawerk. He was the student of Wiener, and he also was very influenced by a book by Wiese. But actually, I think if I were to say what the great influences were on him, I would think of English writers such as Adam Smith and Burke. So he settled down in England, and he debated with Keynes. He was a young man at the time, in his early 30s, but all of a sudden he became a very famous economist, because Keynes, of course, was prominent, foremost in fame in England at the time. And the debating against him were a couple of very famous English economists, and he was added to them, so he more or less acquired the same level of prestige, and was very, very, he had tremendous good name. He strongly criticized Keynes's treatise on money, and eventually got Keynes to admit that he was wrong over his theory of capital and interest. So Hayek said, well, this man is finished after this admission. When Keynes published the general theory of money, of employment, interest, and money, Hayek strangely did not write about it. Later on, he said he had given Keynes up as debunked, but he admitted it had been an error of his, that he should have commented. But actually, at the time, he was immersed in a debate with Lange and other Marxist economists on whether the system of central planning was viable. As you probably know, Mises and he held the view that the central planning would not be viable, that central planning implied missing a tremendous amount of knowledge that can only be diffused, accumulated and diffused by the market. And of course, about half a century later, the verdict of history was returned with tremendous clarity. They were right, and Lange and company were wrong. Then, when World War II broke out, the LSE moved to Cambridge. He went to Cambridge and loved it. And there he began writing the book that would give him international fame, which is The Road to Serfdom. The Road to Serfdom appeared in 1944. It was published simultaneously on both sides of the Atlantic, and it was a roaring success from the word go. It was translated into many languages. The Reader's Digest ran an abridgment of it, and that was a bestseller. And the editors arranged a lecture tour in the United States, which was very, very successful, but not free from strong attacks from the left. Those of you who can read, can find Hayek on Hayek, which is a book of interviews on Hayek, which I highly recommend, will see the viciousness with which he was attacked at the time by a few people who would be called liberals. Of course, Hayek called himself a liberal in a totally different sense. The book is generally given credit for having contributed to stemming the totalitarian wave that seemed was going to inundate the Western world, together with other books that in their general inspiration were akin, like 1984 by George Orwell and Darkness at Noon by Arthur Koestler. "1944 was a very important year in Hayek's work, because apart from publishing The Road to Serfdom, he did another very important thing. He gave a lecture in Cambridge in which he announced that he proposed to found a society of classical liberals to promote the exchange of ideas, to overcome the isolation in which many of them were in their own countries. And this was 1944. Europe was impoverished by the war, and Europeans alike. And so he had great difficulty, and only in 1947 did he succeed in bringing 39 outstanding intellectuals of similar philosophy to the mountain village of Mont Pelerin near Geneva, and near the Lake of Geneva, very near Vevey. And they were 39. "17 from the United States, 8 from Great Britain, 4 from Switzerland, 4 from France, and 1 from each of Italy, Germany, Norway, Denmark, Belgium, and Sweden." Popper, who was mentioned today several times by the president of this country, and Mises were there. Friedman and Stigler, both very young men, were there. The French, Maurice Allais and Bertrand de Jouvenel. Röpke and Eucken, 2 Germans. Robbins and Jukes, 2 Englishmen, all very famous. Of these 39 people, 4 became eventually Nobel laureates. when Hayek announced the formation of the society, his purpose of founding such a society, he suggested the name of the Acton Tocqueville Society, mentioning two historians, not two economists, of two European liberals in the classical sense again. And but this was turned down. This was turned down, and they couldn't agree on any name. So one said, why not call it after the place where we are holding this meeting? So they called it the Mont Pelerin Society, only because they were at Mont Pelerin. The Mont Pelerin Society has just turned its 50th anniversary, is a very special kind of society. It doesn't have any premises, any staff, and it shuns contact with the press, doesn't publish anything. Of course, members or guests who present papers are free to publish them, and they often have. But the society itself does very little of that. The purpose is not to publicize free market. It's just to allow people of a like mind, as the original purpose of Declaration of Purposes says, of like mind, to exchange ideas, to gather strength for the debate that occurs outside. Hayek was elected and re-elected president several times, and eventually he was named life president, honorary president for life. After the war, Hayek's work had great unity. He became less interested in economic theory, particularly in the technical aspects, and much more in political philosophy. In 1950, he left the London School of Economics for Chicago, but not as an economist, but as a political philosopher that he had in fact become. In the University of Chicago, he wrote one of his monumental works. One was the Constitution of Liberty that I mentioned. No, this was the Constitution of Liberty that he wrote while in Chicago. And several tracts on monetary aspects, such as one that is very well known about the denationalization of money, choice in currency it's called, published by the IEA. At the age of 70, he retired from Chicago and accepted a chair in the University of Freiburg in Germany. There, he wrote another monumental work, Law, Legislation, and Liberty. Notice the word law and legislation and the difference that he was drawing between the two, as well as his last book, The Fatal Conceit, which is a worthy broach to his system, which finally I would like to summarize in the little time that I have left. Freedom, social life in the great society, that is society of the modern type, by contrast with the tribes or bands or extended families of primitive societies, imply the interaction of many individuals, a great many individuals, millions of individuals. How is freedom compatible with order? To many people, there is no possibility that order can exist without a central direction. This is really, I think, the main problem that Hayek addressed. To some people, freedom means that the political coordination of all these great many people is done democratically. Every man or woman of age and of sound mind can vote. But this is not what Hayek meant by freedom. Far from it. He was aware that the tyranny of majorities has played a tremendous role in history. So he concentrated on the concept of spontaneous orders. Adam Smith had spoken about the invisible hand. He was tremendously misunderstood by many people, particularly about theologians, who thought that he was referring to providence. By no means. He was just trying to symbolize the working of spontaneous order. The economy works without a direction, provided there are rules of just conduct that are enforced and that must be followed by everybody. You don't need anyone to say this this good is becoming scarce, economize on it. Prices will tell that. And the reverse. Boost your consumption of this other good, because the lower prices would be telling that. So he made a study of the spontaneous orders. This, I think, is a great contribution of Hayek's. To finish, let me say that a very interesting aspect of Hayek is his insistence that freedom will work under certain cultural constraints, on a certain cultural ground. Not all cultural grounds are propitious. In fact, it should be visible that free societies are something very new if they have been reached. And civilization is a phenomenon that is 6,000 years old. He said that the foundations of the presuppositions on which must exist for a market economy to evolve are of ethical nature. That without honesty, disposition to hard work, and a number of virtues that include several virtues related to the family, the market economy could not function. In this sense, in the sense that he associates the system of freedom with culture, with history, with traditions. He is a special kind of liberal. There are others who believe that any society, that all men partake of the same rationality. Therefore, if you have a system that will enforce contracts and protect property, and a small government, they will work. Hayek is concerned about moral aspects that, for instance, at present constitute a threat to the Western civilization. He does not take civilization for granted. The two kinds of libertarians or liberals, whatever you want to call them, are compatible. Most of the time they agree, but when we look at our society to the future and come to wonder whether our system will flourish or deteriorate, then I think the guide of Hayek is of prime importance. And now I'm prepared to answer any questions that you, try to answer any questions that you may have.